How important are the new US News and World Report rankings? Most of you know that new rankings were released this past week, and there were some shakeups. There were some schools that rose in the rankings. There were some schools that fell in the rankings. There were some schools that fell a lot in the rankings. There are some schools that jumped in the rankings. But honestly, how much does this matter? How important is this to your life, to your law school decisions, to your application process? What if you're already in school? Let's talk about rankings. Now, we're going to cover a couple of things today. We are going to cover, again, just how much you should care about the rankings and from a more nuanced perspective, because I think it's really easy to say, I don't care about them at all, or yes, rankings are life. Full disclosure, spoiler alert, I will never say rankings are life. They're certainly closer to the don't care spectrum than, they are everything. And I know for some of you, rankings are everything. We're going to talk about that. So we're going to figure out how much you should really care about these new rankings. Then we are going to talk about what you should be focused on, truly, especially if you are trying to make a decision about schools, where to apply, or if you've already been accepted, where to go. And then we're going to talk about how rankings factor into your future, right? And I think that's one of the most important points that I want to talk about today is just like, how do we think long-term about the role of rankings? Now, my general rule of thumb is that rankings should be taken with a grain of salt. They're important in so far as people still place importance on them. It's one of those very weird things. Like if we all woke up and decided today that we didn't care about rankings, and if employers also woke up with us and decided that they didn't care about rankings, the rankings would have no weight. They're one of those things that don't actually matter unless we give it the time and energy to matter. It's not like bar passage rate, which will always matter and should always matter. We can't just decide, we don't really care if people don't pass the bar, because it's like, well, hold on. Time out. That's the whole reason why we're going to law school. But there is something to be said for the fact that rankings are a construct. We give it power because we care. But I am also not going to pretend like we operate in a just world. What do I mean by that? I know, as a woman of color, that I have to work sometimes twice as hard to get half as much, right? I know that you guys have probably heard that. If you're neurodiverse, if you're from a marginalized community, if you're LGBTQ, you know that, to be honest, the world is not a level playing field. Even if you're just a woman, right? You know that the world is not a level playing field, and that is certainly true in the legal space. So to the extent that you are already climbing an uphill battle, I think that's where this nuanced conversation of how important our rankings really come in, because I know that if I'm already climbing an uphill battle, if there is anything that I can do to help me make the hill a little less steep, maybe, to get a seat at the table, or to even just get in the room, even if I don't have a seat, right? To stand on the wall. Sometimes things like perceived prestige, these markers of elitism, and that's what it is, it's markers of elitism. They sometimes are the signal that lets those with power and those in a position to make the rules let us into the room. There is nothing just about that. There is nothing okay with that being a metric or a bar for which certain people are able to get their foot in the door to certain jobs or certain professions over others, because listen, I went to Harvard Law School, and I will tell you that we are not inherently smarter or better attorneys than those that go to, shout out to my home state, University of Baltimore, University of Maryland, right? To be honest, the people at University of Baltimore, University of Maryland probably know way more practical law than I did when I graduated from Harvard Law, because mostly we talk about theory. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just completely different schools of thought. But I don't consider myself a better attorney or more prepared to defend the rights of children in a family law case because I went to Harvard Law School over someone that went to University of Baltimore, University of Maryland. There are probably people who do. And that's, the definition of elitism. But I don't, right? I don't think that the measure of your worth is tied up into where you went to school. And I think this is really important because I know that there are people who, whether they're happy or sad, as the rest of these decisions kind of roll in, you're putting all of this worth into kind of where you got into school. You're putting this worth into who said yes and who said no. When, to be honest, who said yes and who said no, there's so many other factors beyond just who you are as a person. And your application materials, there's all of the university priorities. There's the fact that they probably would have loved to admit 20,000 people, but like they cannot do so, right? And so they have to every year say no to exceptionally qualified candidates. And just because you got a no does not mean you're not exceptionally qualified. However, even with all of this said, with all of my feel good, kumbaya, we're all great, we're all worthy, I understand the reality of the situation is that there are certain doors and opportunities that are easier for me to open because I went to Harvard Law School than the University of Baltimore. Now, there may be doors in the great state of Maryland, which is a great state. There may be doors that are probably easier for some University of Baltimore students, right? That local networking and that sort of thing. And I want to also make sure that, you understand that I'm not saying there are doors that I can only get to because I went to Harvard Law School. I just said those doors might be easier to open. But you can do a lot from a wide variety of law schools. Your path might just not be the same, right? You can work in big law from a variety of law schools, but it is certainly easier from the top schools because they come to you and it's like given to you on a silver platter. But if you really want that and you're not looking at the top schools, you certainly can access that. Your path is just going to be a little different. What is the importance of that? I'm saying this to say that I'm not saying rankings don't matter, because they do insofar as they make certain doors easier to open because of the elitist society that we live in and people attaching worth to things that really they should not be. But because we live in a flawed society, I'm not going to tell you just to pretend we live in a just society, right? So you should consider rankings to some extent, especially if you're from a marginalized community, because that's the world that we're operating in. And until the world changes and the game changes, I will want you to, play a little bit by the rules, right? We play by the rules and then we get into positions of power and we disrupt things. But I want you to get into positions of power so you can disrupt things. That's really important to me. A lot of what went into the changes of the last week's world rankings, right, for law schools, the U.S. News and World Report rankings, a lot of it had to do with bar passage rate. There's some metric that changed also about how they calculate professional librarians. But when you look at that bar passage rate, they changed a couple things in there, right? They changed the fact that they're now looking at bar passage rate across all the jurisdictions that students took from. And there's a number of schools that, because of COVID, had a lot more, the bar privilege, right? And you were allowed to practice law without necessarily sitting for the bar, depending on certain states because of COVID. And there are a lot of very nuanced things that happened, right? I think it's good that the rankings placed more of an emphasis on overall bar passage rate. I think we can't ignore the fact that it's looking at data that was an anomaly because of COVID and this, situation that we were in. That being said, the rankings are so sensitive that even variances, very slight, 2% more here, 1% more there, can cause really big shakeups in the rankings. And that's kind of what happened. Now, you guys all know, probably, Harvard Law School fell out of the top 3 for the first time in however many decades. It's now tied for 4. Okay. And there's a question on TikTok, well, is Columbia better than Harvard Law School now? Nothing has changed about this school. Neither school has changed. And I think that's really important perspective. Like yesterday or last week, Harvard Law School was not a better school than it was today. And Columbia was not a very different school last year even than it is today, right? Like these are institutions that have been around for hundreds of years. This is one ranking methodology. If tomorrow, U.S. News and World Report said that, again, shout out to my state, University of Maryland and University of Baltimore was number one, right? Let's just say they realized that Marylanders are actually just, the bee's knees. And so they were like, all Maryland schools, top of the rankings, because we're gonna change the methodology such that the percentage of Old Bay that your law school dining hall has is a very large factor in your rankings. I mean, some states don't even know what Old Bay is. But let's just say that's what happened, right? And all of a sudden, University of Baltimore and University of Maryland are 1 and 2. And then we have Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Harvard, whatever, right? U Chicago. Nothing will have substantially changed about any of those schools. The only thing that's changed is the methodology that their rankings have. And you have to change happens over time. Even schools that have new diversity measures or, they're really working on their employment score or they're really working on their 1L retention rate. These are things that change over time, right? They are not things that change completely in 1 year. So if you look at last year's rankings and you look at this year's rankings and you're like, oh my God, this school fell 21 points. It did not become 21 points less of a school. Like it's the same school, right? It's just a different way of looking at it. And I think that's really, really important. So if you're sitting here like, well, now I don't know if I want to go to Columbia or Harvard, I would tell you the same advice whether or not the rankings changed. You need to figure out what kind of environment you want. You need to figure out what you want to do with your career. It's professional school. What are your career goals? Who are your students, your classmates that you're going to be around? What are the professors? Do you like New York City? Do you like Boston? Is there a financial difference? The questions that I would have you ask, which we talked about a couple weeks ago about how to choose a law school, whether that's how to choose a law school you've already been accepted to or even how to choose law school to apply, those are the same questions I would be giving you now because honestly, who really cares that, Harvard is now tied for 4th. Okay, right? It's not changing any of their programming. It's not changing their professors. People are not quitting in droves and giving up their tenure. None of that is happening because it's the same school. And so I urge you to kind of look at it similarly. Now, if there's like a larger situation, if a school drops 50 points, none of them did, but if a school dropped 50 points, that might give you pause, but then I would actually point you to the number 2 thing that I want you to focus on today. I want you to look at their metrics. Did their employment score, their bar passage rate, or their median salary change? Those are the 3 things that I really want you to focus on. I'm going to say it again. Bar passage rate, employment score, median salary. Law School Admission Council, LSAC, acquired the Law School Transparency, LST. So LSAC acquired LST. But for some time, the LST reports and all that stuff is still up. So if you put in University of Maryland, LST, or, whatever, Harvard, LST, it will give you an overview and it will show you historical data on those bar passage rates, the employment score, and the median salary. Now, it's important to note that in some states in which you did not have to take the bar during COVID and you could, kind of waive in with bar privilege, in some states, the employment score went up because it was easier for them to get a job because they didn't have to wait and study for 3 months and then take the bar, right? They could just start practicing right away. So some of the employment score data is actually, again, tied to the pandemic. There's also the fact that it's a pandemic. So I'm sure for some schools, their employment score went a little down because why? It's a pandemic, right? So there are a lot of factors that go into play with, again, how those rankings happened. What I want you to do is I want you to look at the 509 ABA reports for the school for, the last year and the year before. So take a 2-year snapshot. They should usually have also employment data that kind of breaks down where students are going, what kinds of firms, how big the firms are, public interest, median salaries, all that good stuff. And I want you to ask yourself, is there a big difference? Now, if there is a big difference, if all of a sudden, because it started looking at maybe students that are taking the bar in other states, if their bar passage rate went from 90% to 45%, I don't think that happened. But if that happened, then I want you to think about that and ask yourself, okay, I know that some of the bar measures changed because it included students that, take the bar in different jurisdictions. Am I such a student? Is this the University of Iowa, and am I planning to practice in Iowa? Or am I trying to go to the University of Iowa, but trying to then practice in Florida? And I am actually concerned maybe their out-of-state students don't pass the bar, or students looking to go to work or to take the bar in other states. Maybe they have a really low bar passage rate. Maybe that's something I want to ask the school about. Maybe I want to call career services and have a very lovely, non-accusatory conversation with the very nice humans that work there, right? That could be an option. Maybe you can look at the employment score and see, okay, did something really change one year to another? Maybe it was the pandemic. Maybe there's something else. Maybe they lost a fellowship, or maybe they didn't, right? Maybe nothing changed at all. Again, look at that median salary. So I want you to look at some metrics that are actually important, because all of those numbers in some way or shape, along with like your peers' opinion, right? Like there's a lot of weight placed into how other law schools view you, which is, it's really convoluted when you think about it. And of course, LSAT and GPA and all those kind of things, right? There's a lot that goes into the rankings. But, the opinion of other schools is one of those things that go into the rankings. And so I want you to look at some of the more pertinent numbers to your life: bar passage, employment score, median salary. Even looking at what your career type is, like, do you want to go to big law? Does the school send students to big law? Do you want to work in public interest? Does the school send students to public interest? Look at, financial, are they giving the same amount of scholarships year after year? Or did their budget for scholarships seem to get cut because they used to be giving out X% of scholarships and now the median amount of scholarships is half that? I want you to look at some real numbers. Right? Those are the things that matter to you, not whether or not it dropped 17 points. Look at some real numbers and see if there are meaningful changes year after year. If they're not, then most likely what happened is that your school dropped because the methodology changed. And you have to also understand that for a lot of schools, they're very close together, right? Like, honestly, most of these schools do not have scores, like raw scores, that are very far apart. So, again, little changes, it's a very sensitive ranking. Little changes can cause big drops or big gains. But, if we look into point 3, like, how do you look at your rankings in the future? What I want to remind you is that US News and World Report, well, they make money off of rankings coming out, right? And when they change the methodology, people are very excited. And then when the rankings do big shifts, think about the number of people that probably purchase access to the full list this week. Probably a lot, right? Why? Because everyone's curious. Curiosity brings dollars. Capitalism. Okay, so the likelihood of US News World Report changing their methodology at least once or twice in the next 3 to 5 years, very high. What does that mean? That means that the rankings are likely going to change at least once or twice in the next 3 to 5 years. So why would you make a decision about what the rankings look like today? You're going to go to law school for the next 3 years of your life. And 3 years from now, the school could be ranked completely different. We don't know, right? We don't know. Like I said, they might decide that Old Bay in the, cafeteria or the law school dining hall, if they have one, is a very important factor. And, again, the Maryland schools might just rise to the top because of our prevalence and love for Old Bay. Maybe they decide that, right? Maybe a Maryland trustee takes over the list. Who knows? Probably not, but a girl can hope, because Old Bay is great, and it should be something that is found in every school in every state. But, we don't know what the rankings are going to change to in the next couple of years. Now, I know that they have been trying and sort of failing, but maybe we'll try again to figure out how to really weight diversity into the rankings. Again, they tried, sort of failed, but it's quite possible in the next 3 to 5 years that they're going to try again to increase the weight that diversity and accessibility play into law school rankings. That will probably, if they do that, it will probably change the rankings significantly again. I don't know. I mean, I'm not I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that it is quite likely that the rankings 5 years from now are not going to be the same rankings that they are today. The rankings 3 years from now probably will not be the same rankings that they are today. The rankings 5 years from now might differ from the rankings 3 years from now. And the rankings 10 years from now, who knows, right? Could be totally different. Now, there are some schools, like, do I think Harvard's going to drop to the unranked law school territory? No, I do not think so, right? There are some changes that I think are not likely to happen. Schools kind of, they do the shifting thing, but honestly, like the top 20 schools, they just sort of shift around each other, and that's fine, right? The little tiny shifts. There's definitely more volatility kind of lower down the list, and that's just because those schools, I think they're really just neck and neck with a lot of factors. But what I don't want you to do is make a decision today based on rankings today that will likely change. You want to make decisions based on factors that are actually going to impact what kind of lawyer you're going to be. Now, remember, I did start this conversation by saying that I understand that rankings are important because they are metrics by which some people assign worth, and especially if you're from a marginalized community, that is important, right? We kind of need everything that we can get. And so sometimes if you're weighing a school that's ranked in the top 10, and you're weighing a school that's ranked, about 80 or 90. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty significant jump in rankings. But I bet if you were to look at things like bar passage rate, employment score, median salary, you would also see a pretty big difference from the school that's in that top 10 and the school that's below 90, right? There's probably a big difference, if nothing else, in median starting salary. And that alone might justify some of, the decisions that you make in terms of weighing whether the investment of one school is worth taking a lower ranked school that might give you more financial freedom because they're giving you more scholarship dollars. But honestly, the doors, again, that might be open from the higher ranked school justify taking out some more loans for that. But that is not solely because this school is ranked this and that school is ranked that. It's because of those factors that play in to those rankings. So I always want you to be your own detective, right? Don't just accept things as they're told to you. We're all going to be attorneys. So we can't just accept things as they're told to you. If I said the sky is purple, I mean, maybe it is because sometimes it does a cool sunset thing, but probably it's not right now, right? But you can't just take my word for it. I want you to go outside and look. And so it's the same thing with the rankings. Don't just take US News World Report's word for it. Okay, my school is now, this, fall from grace. I don't like it anymore. I'm going to choose a different school because this one ranking said so. That's not what I want you to do. I want you to be your own detective. I want you to figure out what things have changed between this year and last year, if you can figure that out. If and most of those informations, they're on the 509 reports. It's completely free. They must disclose them by federal law, so you have that information at your fingertips. And then if you're comparing two schools and you're confused because their rankings have you all kinds of ways, look again at the hard numbers and hard data facts. Also look to see, okay, I want to practice law in Florida. What percentage of students go to Florida from this law school? I want to practice in big law. What percent of students go to a national law firm from this school? I really want to do this area of law. Is this something that the school has supports for? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I want you to be thinking about really sound factors and use the rankings as maybe an invitation to do more digging. If a school changed drastically in rankings, and I'm not talking about 2 points, y'all, 2 points is not drastic. But if a school changed drastically in rankings, I invite you to see what are the factors that may have contributed to that. And like I said, it might just be some of the very unique circumstances that we had in 2020 and 2021 with the pandemic, right? Like that might just be, oh, okay, this makes sense. I understand now. right? The ABA Journal had a great article on that this morning. If you are able to get a hold of the ABA Journal online, I definitely encourage you to read it and to dig into what some of the deans were saying about that as well. So use the rankings as an invitation to do more research, but not as the answer itself. I hope this video was helpful. Make sure you share it with a friend, like and subscribe, rate and review. We are really excited about what's happening this spring with this new quarter. And I'm really excited to hear where you guys decide to deposit because I know it's a really exciting decision. It's a really big decision, but it's one that I know that you'll make logically after doing research because we focus on that. I want you to make smart financial investments for your future. If you need me, you can email us at hello@smontgomeryconsulting.com or submit a question to bit.ly/breakintolawschool. I will see you guys very soon.